I had just turned 63 when my son-in-law handed me a cardboard box and told me to pack my things. He didn't yell. He didn't even raise his voice. That was the part that stayed with me, how calm he was about it. Like he'd been rehearsing that moment for months. Maybe he had. "We need the space," he said. "You've been here long enough." I stood in the hallway of my own house. The house I'd bought in 1991. The house where my daughter took her first steps on that slanted kitchen floor. And I didn't say a word. Because what do you say to something like that? I just looked at him. And then I looked past him to where my daughter was standing near the staircase, arms crossed, not meeting my eyes. That was the part that broke me. Not him. Her. But let me back up. Because you need to understand how we got there. And before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you what I found in that old grocery bag she threw at me on the porch, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given someone everything, trusted them completely, and then watched them use that trust like a weapon against you? If you have, then you already know part of this story. The rest of it, I promise you, you won't see coming. My name is Frederick. I'm 64 years old now, retired from 31 years working for the county water department in Dayton, Ohio. I own, or I thought I owned, a 3-bedroom house on Clover Mill Road that my late wife Josephine and I bought for $82,000 back when this neighborhood still had oak trees lining both sides of the street. The oaks are mostly gone now, Dutch elm disease, then the drought of 2012. But the house is still standing. It's worth somewhere around $340,000 now, according to the last appraisal I got in the spring. I have one daughter. Her name is Nadia, and she is the best thing that ever happened to me. That's not me being sentimental. That's just the truth. When Josephine passed 7 years ago from ovarian cancer, it was Nadia who drove 4 hours from Cincinnati every other weekend to check on me. It was Nadia who cleaned out her mother's closet when I couldn't bring myself to open the door. It was Nadia who sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning while I just talked. Just talked about nothing, about everything. About the way Josephine used to hum while she cooked, about the trip we never took to New Orleans, about small things I was terrified I'd forget. So when Nadia called me 2 years ago and said she and her husband were struggling, mortgage behind, his business not doing well, I didn't hesitate. I told her to come home. Her husband's name is Douglas. Douglas Mercer. He sold commercial HVAC equipment and had started his own company about 4 years before all this happened. On paper, it sounded solid. In reality, as I would later learn, there were judgments filed against the company, 2 failed contracts, and a loan from a private lender that he'd rolled over twice without telling Nadia. But I didn't know any of that when they moved in. What I knew was that my daughter needed help, and I had a house with 2 empty bedrooms and a retirement income that covered my needs without strain. My pension from the county was $2,200 a month. I had a small 401k I'd barely touched. And I had a savings account, money Josephine and I had put away over decades, slowly, carefully, in the way people who grew up without much tend to do. Just under $400,000 sitting in a credit union account that I hadn't mentioned to anyone, not to Nadia, not to Douglas, not to anybody. Josephine always said, "Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing." She meant it about generosity, about not giving to get credit. But I applied it to everything, money especially. Douglas moved in like he was doing me a favor. I noticed it within the first week, little things at first. He'd sit at the head of the table. My table, the one Josephine and I bought at an estate sale in 1998, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He'd answer the door when neighbors knocked. He'd make comments about the house, small suggestions, improvements he was thinking about making. New gutters, a different paint color for the shutters, a fence along the back property line. I let it go. I told myself he was just a man who needed to feel useful. I understood that. When you're failing at something you built, when the thing you were supposed to be good at is falling apart, you reach for control somewhere else. I gave him room. But Douglas wasn't looking for room. He was looking for a foothold. About 4 months in, he started mentioning the house in different ways. Place like this, in this zip code, you could list it for $350 easy. You know, if you ever wanted to downsize, I know some people. Have you thought about what happens to the property when… And then he'd stop himself, like he caught his own sentence. I heard every word he didn't finish. Then one evening in March, he sat down across from me while I was watching the news and said he'd been talking to a real estate attorney. He said he had an idea that would benefit the whole family. He wanted me to transfer the house into a family trust. Him, Nadia, and me. Equal thirds. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I turned back to the television and said, "I'll think about it." I never had any intention of thinking about it. 2 weeks later, the pressure changed. He started leaving papers on the counter. Printed pages from legal websites about elder care planning, Medicaid asset protection, estate taxes. Highlighted sections. Like I was supposed to find them by accident and come to the conclusion on my own. I gathered every page he left out and put them in the recycling bin without a word. Then one night I heard them through the wall. My bedroom shares a wall with the guest room, and the house is old enough that the insulation is mostly ambition. Douglas's voice, low and flat. He's not going to live forever. You know what happens if he dies without a plan? The state gets involved, probate takes forever, we could lose everything. And then Nadia's voice, quieter. He has a will, Douglas. And wills can be contested. We need something more solid. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and I thought about Josephine. I thought about the oak trees. I thought about how a house is not just a house. It's the accumulated weight of a life. All those small decisions made in good faith, stacked up like rings inside a tree. I thought about how I had made a mistake letting him in. What happened next came fast. Douglas came to me on a Tuesday afternoon in September and told me he'd found a buyer for the house. He said Nadia had agreed, that they'd talked it over, that it was the practical decision. He set a folder on the kitchen table with comps, a proposed listing price, a name of a realtor, all of it printed, organized, paper-clipped. I haven't agreed to sell anything, I said. Dad. He called me Dad, which he had never done before in 2 years. You're 63 years old. This house is too much for one person. With the proceeds, you could move somewhere with real amenities. A community, people your age, activities. I said I haven't agreed to sell anything. He leaned back. That calm again. That practiced calm. Nadia thinks it's a good idea. I stood up, picked up his folder, and held it out to him. Tell Nadia to come talk to me herself. She didn't. Not that day. Not that week. What she did do, or what I thought she was doing, was stop talking to me. At dinner, she kept her eyes on her plate. When I said good morning, she nodded. She stopped sitting with me in the evenings. The small daily warmth we built after Josephine died, all those habits of closeness, it drained away in a matter of days. Like water out of a tub. I can tell you honestly that hurt worse than anything Douglas ever said. I could dismiss him. I couldn't dismiss her. I started spending more time outside. Walking. I've always walked. 30 years of early mornings before work. 4 miles before the sun was fully up. Now I walked longer, later in the cold. I walked past the school where Nadia learned to ride a bike. Past the library where Josephine used to volunteer on Thursdays. I walked to keep myself from sitting still. Because sitting still meant thinking. And thinking led somewhere I didn't want to go yet. The documents came on a Friday. Douglas presented them to me at the kitchen table with a man I'd never met. Introduced as a family advisor, though he turned out to be a notary Douglas had hired. The papers were a property transfer agreement, transferring my home into the LLC Douglas had apparently formed under the name Mercer Family Holdings. He had already signed. He had already had Nadia sign. I looked at those signatures for a long time. You need to sign tonight, Douglas said. The LLC registration has a deadline. I picked up the papers, stood up, walked to my bedroom, and closed the door. I heard him knock twice. Then silence. I called a friend of mine. A man I'd known since we both worked the night shift at the county in the early 90s. His name is Arthur, and he spent the last 15 years of his career as a property assessor. Not a lawyer, but a man who understood documents and deadlines and the ways people manufacture urgency. I read him what the papers said over the phone. He said, "Frederick, don't sign a single thing. Call an attorney in the morning, first thing." I didn't sleep that night. I called a real estate attorney, a woman named Patricia Cross, whose office is over on Warren Street, first thing Saturday morning. She agreed to see me Monday. Over the weekend, I made copies of everything Douglas had left on that table and kept them in my car, in a folder under the front seat. Monday morning, I drove to Patricia's office while Douglas thought I was at my regular doctor's appointment. I showed her everything. She looked through it slowly. Then she looked up at me and said, "Mr. Frederick, these documents have several irregularities. The LLC was formed in another state. The transfer language is non-standard, and frankly," she paused, "this has the hallmarks of financial elder abuse. We need to document this carefully before you do anything." I heard the words elder abuse and something shifted in my chest. Not shame. Anger. Slow, cold anger. The kind that doesn't burn, it calcifies. Patricia advised me not to let on that I'd seen a lawyer. She also told me something I hadn't expected. She said I should talk to Adult Protective Services. She said what Douglas was doing had a name, a legal category, and that I was far from the first person she'd seen in my situation. I made the call that same afternoon. When I got home, something was different. Nadia was in the kitchen, alone. Douglas's truck wasn't in the driveway. She had her back to me, washing dishes, and she didn't turn around when I came in. I sat down at the table. After a long moment, she turned off the water. She still didn't look at me. "Nadia," I said. "Don't," she said. Her voice was strange, tight, like something being held under pressure. "I need to know where you stand." She was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said very quietly, "I know what he's doing, Daddy." I didn't move. "I've known for a while," she said. "I found the LLC paperwork in his email 6 weeks ago. I found the loan he took against your property value. He forged your name on an inquiry form to get a mortgage estimate. He's been telling his lender that the house is already in the LLC." The room was very still. "Why didn't you tell me?" She finally turned around. Her eyes were red, not from crying now, but from having cried a long time ago and then stopping. The kind of eyes that have made a decision. "Because I needed time to make sure I had everything," she said. "If I told you and you confronted him, he would have destroyed the evidence and denied everything. I needed copies. I needed a paper trail. I needed—" She stopped. "I needed it to be enough to actually stop him." She'd been building a case. For 6 weeks, quietly, while acting distant from me, while letting me believe she had chosen his side. She had been photographing documents, forwarding emails to a private account, recording conversations on her phone. Not one conversation. 11. She slid a manila envelope across the table to me. "This is everything," she said. "Enough for the DA's office, I think." I opened the envelope. Inside were printed emails, screenshots, a USB drive, handwritten notes with dates and times. Everything organized, everything labeled. I sat there with all of it spread across Josephine's table and I couldn't speak. 3 days later, Douglas came home to 2 things he hadn't anticipated. A detective from the County Financial Crimes Unit, and the locksmith who had already changed the dead bolts on my instruction. He tried the calm voice at first. Then he tried Nadia. When he realized she wasn't going to back him up, when she stood in the hallway with her arms folded and looked at him the way a woman looks at someone she's already finished grieving, the calm cracked. He was arrested on charges of attempted property fraud, forgery of financial documents, and elder financial exploitation, a felony charge in Ohio that carries up to 5 years per count. His attorney later argued for a lesser plea. The judge wasn't interested in lesser pleas. Douglas Mercer was sentenced to 7 years. The LLC was dissolved. The fraudulent mortgage inquiry was flagged and the lender was notified. My property remained and remains entirely in my name. But here is the part I need to tell you about, the part I think about more than any of the rest of it. The morning before the detective came, before any of that, Nadia had to leave the house early. She had to meet with the DA's office downtown to go over the recordings. She left before I was awake. When I came downstairs, there was an old plastic grocery bag sitting on the porch outside the front door. The handle was knotted. It looked like trash, the kind of thing someone sets out the night before pickup and forgets to move to the bin. I almost walked right past it, but something made me pick it up. Inside was a smaller canvas bag, zipped shut. Inside the canvas bag were three things: a letter in Nadia's handwriting, a passbook for a savings account I didn't recognize, and a debit card with my name printed on it. I sat down on the porch steps right there in my slippers and I read her letter. She wrote, "Daddy, I've been putting money into this account for 4 years. Every birthday you refused to take money from me. Every Christmas you said you didn't need anything. So I put it here instead. I was going to give it to you when the time was right. I think now is right. The account has $340,000 in it. I don't want it back. It's not charity and it's not payment. It's yours. You gave me everything. I needed to give something back. I love you. Don't argue with me about this." I sat on those porch steps for a long time. $340,000. She had been putting money away quietly, month by month, in my name for 4 years. Her salary from her hospital administration job, pieces of it, set aside every month like a woman honoring a private commitment. She hadn't told me because she knew I'd refuse. She knew me. The morning light was coming up over the house across the street. A dog was barking somewhere down the block. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly the same as it had been the morning before, and the morning before that. I folded her letter and held it against my chest. That was 14 months ago. Nadia and I have dinner together every Sunday now. She's renting a small apartment not far from here, and she's been talking lately about buying her own place. I told her I'd help with the down payment. She told me absolutely not. We went back and forth about it for 20 minutes over pot roast and ended up laughing, which is maybe the best thing I can say about where we are. The house is the same. The slanted kitchen floor is the same. I had the gutters replaced this fall, not because Douglas suggested it, but because they needed it, and I got around to it. There are things I think about when I walk in the mornings. I think about how kindness, genuine kindness, looks almost identical to weakness from the outside. I think about how many people in my situation have no Nadia, no one on the inside who stays quiet and builds a case and puts $340,000 in a grocery bag because they know their father won't accept it any other way. I think about how close I came to losing everything, not just the house, but the version of my daughter I thought I understood, before I understood her more deeply than I ever had. I think Douglas believed he was smarter than everyone in that house. He was wrong about that, by exactly one person, and that person was quietly recording him on her phone for 6 weeks. Josephine would have loved that. If you've made it to the end of this, if something here reminded you of something in your own life, your own family, your own home, leave a comment. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, please share it. You never know who's sitting in a house right now wondering if they're alone in what they're going through. They're not. I promise you that. I've had 14 months to think about all of it, and the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that stays with me on those early morning walks, isn't the fraud, isn't the arrest, isn't even the $340,000. It's a simpler question. What kind of person do you decide to be when someone is counting on you not to notice? Douglas decided to be the kind of man who sees an aging widower with a paid-off house and calculates. He was methodical about it. Patient, even. And for a while, that patience looked like it might work. But here's what I've come to understand about that kind of thinking. When you build something on deception, you have to keep building. You can't stop. Every lie requires another one to hold it up. Douglas didn't just forge my name once. He had to construct an entire architecture of pressure, paperwork, and manufactured urgency just to keep the whole thing standing. That is an exhausting way to live. And structures like that always come down eventually, because they have no real foundation. They have nothing underneath them except the assumption that the person being deceived will stay deceived. He underestimated Nadia. That was his first and final mistake. What Nadia did took something I don't think can be taught: a combination of clarity, restraint, and genuine love. She saw what was happening before I fully did. She felt the pull to tell me immediately, to warn me, to let me react. And she chose not to because she had the intelligence to understand that a reaction without evidence would accomplish nothing. She sat with that knowledge for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of watching her father think his daughter had abandoned him, of saying nothing while I walked those cold streets alone. That kind of discipline, staying quiet when everything in you wants to speak, that's not coldness. That's the highest form of protection I've ever seen up close. I think about the men and women who go through what I went through and don't have a Nadia. Who sign the papers because no one is in their corner building a case? Who lose the house, the savings, the piece of their late wife that lives in those walls? That is not a rare story. It happens more than any of us want to admit, in families that look perfectly ordinary from the outside. And it happens because people mistake silence for consent and kindness for surrender. I was kind to Douglas. I gave him a room, a table, time, patience, and I would do most of it again. Not because I was naive, but because living closed off and suspicious is its own kind of loss. What I wouldn't do again is ignore the early signs. The calm voice. The papers left on the counter. The sentences that stopped themselves just short of finishing. Those things deserve to be named when they happen, not 3 months later. The house is still mine. The slanted kitchen floor is still there. On Sunday evenings, when Nadia comes for dinner and we argue about whether I should let her pay for anything, I think about Josephine, who would have seen all of this coming from the very first Sunday. Douglas sat at the head of our table. She always did read people faster than I did. What I know now, at 64, is that integrity compounds the same way savings do, slowly, quietly, over decades, and that the people who try to take shortcuts around it end up with nothing that lasts. Douglas walked out of that house with a felony record and 7 years. I walked out of it with my daughter, my home, and the knowledge that somewhere along the way I must have done something right, because the person I raised chose honesty when it cost her something. That's not luck. That's a life's work paying off in a way you never expected and couldn't have planned for. That's enough for me. That's more than enough.